let's be honest, a lot of my book reviews lately have been pretty negative. And believe it or not, when I started this channel, it was not with the intention of becoming the next like rant review booktuber. Because at the end of the day, my favorite thing to do is to come on here and talk to you about the books that I love. So in this video, I just want to talk to you about the books that I loved so much that I need to reread them. These books are so good, you need to read them twice. Let's kick this off strong and start with my favorite book that I read in 2022, and that is Open Water by Caleb Asmar Nelson. This is a literary fiction novella, so it's a very quick read, but boy did it pack a punch. Obviously this book is so short that I want to be careful I don't spoil anything for you, but basically this book chronicles the relationship between two people, like a modern day romance in London. It also speaks very explicitly about the harm of being a black person living in a racist society and how that impacts somebody in a very like deep internal kind of way. The narration is in second person, which makes this whole experience feel even more intimate than it already is. It's a book about intimacy, about vulnerability, about mental health, and just how painful injustice can be. It was one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking books I've ever read, but it managed to steer clear of like a trauma porn kind of narrative and instead just felt so sensitive and genuine and sweet in many ways as well. Like I said, it was my favorite book of last year. Unfortunately though, it is a debut, which means I have not been able to read anything else by the author. And of course, there's only one solution for that: a good old-fashioned reread. The next book is the only non-fiction title on this list, and it's a book that I often refer to as a favorite, but I haven't read it since it came out like 4 or 5 years ago. And that is City of Trees by Sophie Cunningham. This is a collection of essays on life, death, and our need for a forest. Sophie Cunningham is an Australian author. She's written a few other things, children's books, novels. I've tried some of her other work, but this to me is the absolute standout from what I've read so far. It's nature writing mixed with memoir, some history, some science, some social commentary as well. At the heart of each chapter or each essay is a particular kind of tree that Sophie has had an experience with. And the tree forms kind of the heart or the foundation of each essay. And through the lens of tree and travel writing, she explores some really intimate issues, especially around grief and the loss of her father, as well as her relationships. She explores topics around being a queer woman visiting America, climate change, as well as themes of belonging. But at the heart of it are beautiful trees and an exploration of them and how we interact with them. And ultimately, it was just such a beautiful read. I think it was one of my early introductions to nature writing, and it honestly just blew me away. And for a while, I was kind of chasing the high of reading this book by reading other kind of like memoir, nature writing kind of books. But nothing ever managed to surpass my experience of City of Trees, so it is something that I want to return to and experience all over again. Also, because it's non-fiction, I think it's the only book on this list that I have annotated. Not extensively, but there's plenty of highlights throughout this, and so I think returning to it and re-experiencing the things that I at that time must have found really potent and powerful, I think that'll be an interesting experience in and of itself. Next we have my favorite short story collection ever, and that is Foreign Soil by Maxine Beneba Clark. This is a short story collection with a very strong, solid theme running throughout all of the stories, and that is of belonging or a sense of unbelonging. What it means to feel foreign, whether that is sort of placed on you by people external to yourself or an internal feeling. It explores topics around like a connection to culture and a sense of identity, and how those things can morph and change when moved to a different location. We have examples of people who have grown up in a place but their family comes from somewhere else, and so that very much influences their sense of identity and belonging to a place. There's also some incredibly powerful explorations of displacement and refugees. This book is one of those rare examples of a collection where every entry is solid and it's strong the whole way through. Since I read this several years ago, I've become a Maxine Beneba Clark stan, and I've always wanted to return to where my love for her writing began. This remains my favorite book that I've read from her, and I just think it's such a special collection. Next up for something a little bit fun is All Systems Red by Martha Wells, which is the first book in the Murderbot Diaries. I, like many people, were introduced to this series and this book through the Life's Library, and I first read this book thinking it was a standalone, and I had so much fun with it. But then learning through my friend Laura that this was in fact a series, I was absolutely thrilled. And I've read, I think, the first 4 books. Murderbot is just one of my favorite characters that I've ever read. Basically, it is this security unit kind of android that has managed to gain sentience. And although it shares many qualities with humans, the people that created it, it is not human. It is distinctly Murderbot. I love that the plot of these novellas are very fast-paced and quite linear, but also how the author manages to pack so much heart into her storytelling as well. I want to reread this book and this series for two reasons. One, I just think it's brilliant and it's one of the most enjoyable experiences I've had reading in quite a long time, but also because I have not progressed in the series in quite a while, and I think having that refresher and like re-experiencing the joy with Murderbot all over again would just reinvigorate my love and my passion for the series so that I can move forward with it, especially as we are expecting a new installment later in the year. So a great little book with a whole lot of personality that absolutely lives up to all the hype. I feel like this has become a bit of a cult classic, totally deserved. Another novella sci-fi series that I want to read, although for completely different reasons, is Assam for the Wild, built by Becky Chambers. This is the first book in the Monk and Robot series. This could be described as hopeful dystopia, which sounds ridiculous, but like, I'm sticking with it. This is cozy, wholesome, uplifting, inspiring science fiction. It's set in the future where humans have managed to avert climate catastrophe and now live fairly simple lives compared to what a lot of us live today. They're conscious of their impact on the earth, and so they tread lightly. Our main character Dex is a tea monk, and their job is to basically go around and serve people tea and just listen to them. Our story basically begins when Dex meets and makes friends with a robot living in the wilderness. There's a lot of pretty heavy-handed theming around mortality and living a meaningful life, but this honestly just hit me in all the right ways. I was so emotional while reading this, and it was just one of those totally affirming, comforting kind of reads. And I just know that this would be the perfect thing to reread when I'm just like really struggling, whether it's with my mental health or with the idea of mortality or maybe with grief. I know this book is always going to be here for me in those kind of moments, and that's just something really special. Speaking of books that I found very affirming, this one's a little left of field. It is There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job. This was one of my 3 top favorite books of 2021. This is a contemporary novel that I feel is quintessentially millennial. In this, we meet a young woman who we find out has recently recovered from burnout and is looking to return to the workforce, but she wants an easy job that she's not going to get invested in and isn't going to stress her out. And so we follow along as she moves through different jobs and inevitably finds herself getting invested. Things go wrong, things turn pear-shaped, and she ends up leaving to move on to the next job. Now, I know this book has not been one for everybody. A lot of people compare it to Convenience Store Woman and don't quite like the trajectory of this book. However, due to my own personal lived experience of having quite a severe mental health crisis, being on the disability pension for several years, and then slowly, carefully, cautiously wanting to and trying to return to my idea of meaningful work in a way that could both be sustainable and rewarding, I personally just identified with this so hard. Occasionally this book does veer off into like the absurd or a bit of magical realism, but at the end of the day, it's just about a woman wanting to find a balance in her life where she can contribute to society in what she feels like is a meaningful way without harming herself and her mental health. This is not an anti-capitalist, anti-work book. And don't get me wrong, I love those books, but I also love this book for what it's trying to do and what it is. And now that I'm in a place where I feel like I have at least mostly found that balance for myself, I'm in a job that I love, book selling 3 days a week, which is perfect for me. I think returning to this book could be really quite powerful. Not only because I just loved the reading experience, but also kind of reminding myself of the journey that I've been on and the very intentional balance and boundaries that I've set out for myself. Being reminded of why it's so important for me not to compromise those things, and how powerful it can be for so many of us who are disabled to create lives for ourselves that can be rewarding and sustainable. From memory, I don't think this character ever calls herself disabled, but there was just an awful lot about it that I really identified with, and I loved it. So I both want to re-experience the journey, but also the joy of reading this book. One of my more recent reads that I already know I want to reread is The Dawn Hounds. This is the first in what is going to be a series, although I have no idea when we're going to be getting book 2, and I will definitely plan to reread this before the second book comes out. Partly because it was just such a joy to read, but also because it was quite intricate and complex, and I'm not sure I picked up on every detail despite how much I loved it. This is a Māori-inspired fantasy story with giant mushrooms and pirates. It's inherently queer and spends a lot of time questioning authority and policing. This is one of the most fresh and unique fantasies I've personally ever read. The characters and the world building in particular I felt were stellar. The magic system was interesting and the plot kept me gripped the entire way through. However, this is a debut and I do feel like it fell short slightly in the pacing department, which overall means that I felt like I got a lot of information about some elements of this world, but I sort of felt a little bit in the dark about other parts. And overall, there was just quite a lot happening and a lot to this world. So I know I want to return to it because I feel like I would just take in so much more upon a second read. And come on, it's a queer anti-cop pirate fantasy story. What's not to love? Okay, this next one is another fantasy book that I read last year that you honestly personally might be quite surprised to see on this list. And to be perfectly honest, I don't know that I will reread it, but it is something that I kind of think that maybe I should. And that is the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin, and to be honest, the entire Broken Earth trilogy. This was one of my favorite books of last year, and I think it's the best fantasy book that I've personally ever read. So there's definitely strong incentives for rereading this first installment. However, if you watched some of my videos last year, you will know that I really didn't like books 2 and 3, and in fact, Book 3 made it onto like my least favorite books of the year list. This series is quite complex and it explores a lot of themes. And this first book in particular, the twists and turns and the reveals were honestly just incredible. The format and the way that it was used, also just absolutely exceptional. Overall, this whole thing just felt like a masterpiece. But books 2 and 3 did not feel as intentional with the formatting and the storytelling. And then something that N.K. Jemisin is well known for, whether you love it or you hate it, is that she's very heavy-handed with her themes. Personally, whatever she did in book 1 worked so well for me that I didn't mind. Books 2 and 3, it overpowered my experience of the narrative. However, as I've said time and time again, I loved so many elements of this series, and I do love the conversations that N.K. Jemisin was having. And so that's why I haven't gotten rid of this series yet, partly because I love this first book so much, but also because in the back of my mind, I wonder that if I were to return to this series in 3 or 5 years, I might like come around on it. And as I mentioned, it's just quite an intricate, complex plot and world. And so I'm sure upon reread, I would just pick up on so much more too. So I don't know, this is a bit of a wild card for me personally. I still think that this first book is brilliant though, and definitely worth your time. Another novella that I want to go back and reread at some stage is Every Heart a Doorway by Shauna Maguire. I read this last year and honestly, I didn't love it. It was kind of like 3.5 star territory for me personally. I think in large part that is because it was just not at all what I was expecting when I picked it up. I'd often heard people describe this as a portal fantasy, as cozy, as whimsical. Sometimes people said it had a bit of a fairy tale kind of feeling. And while I can appreciate where all of those descriptors are coming from, this book was so much more dark, and ultimately the plot is a murder mystery plot. And so I think I read this just kind of like in shock about what I was actually reading. Like, it was pretty gory, it was pretty intense. But of course it did also introduce us to the idea of these doors that lead to portal fantasy realms, and how many different children have just kind of like disappeared through these doors into fantastical, strange realms. I have recently though read the second book in this series, and honestly I was floored. I absolutely loved that second book. I think one of the reasons I enjoyed that second book more was because my expectations were readjusted to what they should have been in the beginning, about the tone and the atmosphere and the themes that were going to be explored in this series, but also because the cast in that book is a lot smaller, so it was a little bit easier to get my head around. There are quite a lot of characters that are introduced to us in this first book, which I understand are characters that we're going to return to in future books, but it was a little bit overwhelming and hard to keep track in such a short book, so many characters. So I want to return to this with my expectations readjusted, now that I understand what the series is doing, what the author's trying to do with the series. But also I feel like this is a book that you could continue rereading throughout the series to be reminded of like the little introductions that we get to characters that we then get full books of. I know that's how I feel after reading the second book. Not only do I want to return to it to give it a second chance, but also because I want to re-experience my introduction to the characters that I followed in the second book. Already I'm getting a strong sense that there is a high rereadability level for this series. And then a book that I don't yet own, even though I have already read it twice in the space of 3 months, and I know I want to read it again. That is Even Though I Knew the End by C.L. Polk. I got an advanced listener's copy of the audiobook through Libro FM in December, and the first time I listened to this story was on Christmas Eve while I was baking up a nice gingerbread for Christmas Day. It's an historical fantasy story set in I think like the 1930s in Chicago. Our main character is a magician who we find out sold her soul to the devil. And now she's been given the chance to win her soul back. All she has to do is find the most notorious serial killer in Chicago, known only as the White City Vampire. She's very much aware that this is a dangerous and ridiculous mission, but she decides to give it a go so that she can spend the rest of her life with the woman that she loves. So this is a very occulty historical fiction, but with a great sapphic romance. And although elements of this are quite dark, overall the tone is quite light and fun. And I really did enjoy it upon that first listen, but it is one of those books that I just have not been able to get out of my head. And so recently I decided to give it another listen. And I had just as much fun fun the second time round, maybe even more. I just loved it. I bumped it up to a 5-star rating and immediately knew that this is a book that I'm going to have to buy myself for my shelves because it's one I'm going to want to keep rereading. For me, it's just a perfect balance of atmosphere, tone, setting, characters, fun, adventure, that I know this is going to be one of those books that I just continue returning to, especially if I'm feeling a bit slumpy or just find myself not enjoying what I'm reading. I know that this is a book I can go back to time and time again for a good time. And in fact, if you would like to watch the vlog in which I first read that book, you can check it out right here. In the meantime, I'd love to hear in the comments below, what books have you read that were so good you just know you're gonna have to reread them? A big thank you as always to my wonderful patrons, and especially a big thank you goes to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie. And of course, a big thank you to you for making it all the way to the end. Talk books with me in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, happy reading and happy rereading. Bye.